The land did not forgive. It was a truth etched into every cracked riverbed and sun-bleached animal skull that dotted the vast, empty canvas of the West. Under a sky the color of faded denim, the sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, forging the earth into a hard, unforgiving anvil. Red dust, fine as powdered blood, coated everything. It settled on the brittle leaves of the cottonwoods huddled by the ghost of a creek. It painted the flanks of Elias Thorne's long-suffering cattle, and it filmed the window panes of his small, sturdy ranch house, a lonely bastion against the endless expanse. This was his kingdom of silence and solitude, carved out of a landscape that promised nothing and gave even less without a fight. The wind was the only constant companion, a mournful voice that whispered through the tall, dry grass, telling tales of hardship and lost dreams. It was a land that stripped a man down to his barest essentials, leaving only what was stubborn enough to endure. Elias Thorne was such a man. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of someone who had learned long ago that wasted effort was a sin the land would punish. He was a widower, though the word felt too soft for the ragged-edged void his wife, Mary, had left behind 5 years prior. Grief had settled into the lines around his eyes and in the permanent set of his jaw. Before he was a rancher, he had been a soldier, a boy sent off to a war that had carved its own brand of scars onto his soul, invisible but deeper than any bullet wound. He'd seen enough of men and their cruelties to prefer the honest brutality of nature. He spoke more to his horses than he did to any human, their soft knickers and warm breath a more reliable comfort than words had ever been. His ranch was a reflection of his heart, functional, fortified, and with little room for softness. The fences were strong, the barn was well kept, but the small plot where Mary had once coaxed roses and lavender from the stubborn soil was now reclaimed by weeds and that ever-present red dust. He never went near it. Some memories were like sleeping dogs best left to lie. His solitude was not, however, absolute. It was punctuated by the quiet, steady presence of Clara Mayhew. Clara was the widow from the neighboring homestead, a small cabin a half-mile across the parched plains, close enough to be a neighbor in this sparse country, yet far enough to ensure privacy. She, too, was a creature shaped by loss. Her husband, a good and gentle farmer named Thomas, and their 5-year-old son, Samuel, had been taken by the fever in a single, brutal week 3 years ago. The tragedy had hollowed her out, leaving behind a quiet resilience that mirrored the landscape itself. She drifted into Elias's life not with a sudden crash, but like the slow creep of dawn. At first, it was a loaf of bread left on his porch, then a neatly folded pile of his mended shirts. Soon, her presence became a part of the ranch's rhythm. She would appear in the cool of the morning, her face shielded by a simple bonnet, and wordlessly set to tasks he hadn't even realized needed doing. She'd help him churn butter, her hands moving with a practiced, soothing rhythm. She would sit in his sparse living room, the evening lamplight catching the silver threads in her brown hair, darning his socks with such intense focus it was as if she were stitching the world back together, one thread at a time. They rarely spoke of anything of consequence. Their conversations were about the weather, the price of grain, a new foal in the barn. Theirs was a companionship built in the silent spaces between words. Elias grew accustomed to the soft sound of her movements in his house, a gentle counterpoint to the howling wind. He found himself relying on her presence, on the simple, unspoken understanding that flowed between them. When he came in from a long day, weary to the bone, the sight of a warm stew simmering on the stove and the faint, clean scent of soap that always clung to her was a balm to his frayed spirit. They were close, dangerously so, yet a chasm remained between them. It was a space of shared grief and unspoken respect that neither dared to cross. Sometimes, his hand would brush hers as she passed him a tool in the barn, and a current would pass between them, sharp and surprising. Their eyes would meet for a fraction of a second too long, a whole conversation taking place in that fleeting glance. A flicker of longing, a shadow of sorrow, a stark acknowledgement of their shared loneliness. And then, just as quickly, the moment would be gone. He would turn back to the horse he was shoeing, and she would busy herself with sweeping the hay. The boundary, invisible but unyielding, would be restored. They were two solitary stars orbiting the same black hole of grief, close enough to feel each other's pull but never close enough to collide. Clara's life beyond Elias's ranch was even more isolated, in the small, dusty town of Redemption, a day's ride away. She was a subject of speculation and pity, especially among the other women. They would watch her from behind the curtains of the general store, their whispers following her like a flock of crows. "Poor thing," some would murmur, their pity laced with a self-congratulatory pride in their own intact families. Others were less kind. "Shameless," they'd hiss, seeing her frequent visits to the widower's ranch not as an act of compassion but of desperation. Trying to snare another husband before her first is even cold in the ground. Clara heard the whispers. She saw the sideways glances and the tight, disapproving smiles. Each one was a small stone cast against the fragile walls of her composure. She had learned to carry herself with a quiet dignity, her gaze fixed forward, her face a serene mask that betrayed none of the turmoil within. But the gossip wounded her, driving her further into her shell, making Elias's ranch the only place she felt seen not as the tragic widow or the predatory spinster, but simply as Clara. With him, she did not have to pretend. Her silence was understood, not judged, but silence. Elias was beginning to learn, was a poor companion through the long, dark nights. The older he got, the heavier the quiet in his house became. It wasn't just the absence of Mary's laughter anymore. It was the deafening sound of his own solitary future stretching out before him, as barren and empty as the plains outside his window. He was tired of eating alone, of the sound of his own boots on the floorboards being the only human noise for days on end. He didn't crave romance. He believed that part of his heart had been buried with Mary, but he craved a home. He wanted the warmth of a family, the sense of purpose that came with building something for someone other than himself. He wanted, quite simply, to not be so devastatingly alone. It was this gnawing ache that led him to the advertisement in a worn copy of an Eastern newspaper, a page used as packing in a crate of supplies. It spoke of respectable young women of good character seeking husbands in the West, women willing to trade the poverty and confinement of their lives for the promise of a new start. The idea took root in his mind. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, a transaction. He wasn't a man for courting or flowery words. This felt clean, honest, an arrangement. He wrote the first letter on a cold winter night, the lamp casting a flickering yellow circle on the rough-hewn table. His hand, calloused and more accustomed to holding reins than a pen, felt clumsy. What did a man like him say to a woman he had never met? He wrote of his land, his herd, the house he had built with his own hands. He was honest about his life, describing its hardships and its simple rewards. He wrote, a widower seeking a wife to build a home with. He signed it simply, Elias Thorne. The response came weeks later, carried across the country by train and stagecoach. The handwriting was neat and careful, the words elegant in their simplicity. Her name was Lila Quincy. She was from a crowded, dirty mill town in Massachusetts, the youngest of 7 children with no dowry and fewer prospects. She wrote of her desire for open skies, for a life where her worth wasn't measured by the number of bobbins she could change in an hour. Her letters were filled with a hopeful, almost poetic yearning that touched a part of Elias he thought had long since turned to dust. They began a steady correspondence. With each letter that arrived, the phantom of Lila became more solid in his mind. He would read her words over and over, imagining her voice, the face of the woman who wrote with such quiet intelligence and gentle hope. He began to look forward to the mail rider's arrival with an eagerness that was entirely new to him. In his letters, he built a world for her, a picture of the life that awaited her. He described the fiery sunsets, the surprising beauty of the desert wildflowers after a rare rain, the steadfast loyalty of his best horse, Apollo. He was creating a new future, and in that future, there were only two people, himself and Lila. And so, when he wrote of his daily life, he made a small, seemingly insignificant omission that would change everything. He had to explain the well-kept state of his home, the regular meals, the mended clothes. He wrote of Clara, but he reframed her. He flattened her into a two-dimensional character, a simple footnote in his story. "I have a helper," he wrote one evening, the pen scratching in the quiet house. "A widow from a nearby claim, Mrs. Mayhew. She comes by to assist with chores. A hired hand, of a sort." He read the words back and felt a small, sharp pang of something that felt like dishonesty. It wasn't the whole truth. Clara was not a hired hand. He never paid her a cent, and she would have been offended if he had tried. She was Clara, his friend, his silent keeper. But how could he explain the years of shared silence, the comfortable rhythm of their companionship, the unspoken bond that tied them together, to a woman 1,000 miles away? It was too complicated, too messy. It would require him to look at his own feelings for Clara, to give them a name, and he was not ready to do that. So he chose the simpler, cleaner lie. A hired hand. It tidied her away, placed her neatly in a box where she couldn't complicate the new life he was trying to build. Clara, of course, knew about the letters. She saw the way his eyes would scan the horizon on mail days, the small, almost imperceptible lift in his posture when the writer brought a letter with Eastern postmark. She saw the new stack of envelopes on his mantelpiece, tied with a simple ribbon. He even told her about it. One afternoon while she was kneading dough in his kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. "I've been writing to a woman," he said, his voice casual, his gaze fixed on the far-off mountains. "Back east. A Miss Quincy." Clara's hand stilled in the dough. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the air left her lungs. A cold wave washed over her, so intense she felt dizzy. She had allowed herself to live in a comfortable illusion, a quiet life where her devotion was enough, where the future was a gentle, undefined continuation of the present. In a single sentence, he had shattered it. She felt a pain so sharp and sudden it was like a physical blow. But years of practice in swallowing her own sorrow came to her aid. She drew a slow, steadying breath and resumed her kneading. "Is that so?" she said, her voice miraculously even. "That's nice. Elias, it's not good for a man to be alone." He nodded, seemingly relieved by her placid reaction. He didn't see the knuckles white on her clenched hands, nor the monumental effort it took for her to keep the smile on her face. From that day on, she carried the knowledge of Lila like a stone in her heart. She continued her visits, continued her quiet care. But now there was a ghost in the house with them, the ghost of a woman she had never met, a woman who lived in neat stacks of letters and in the hopeful look in Elias's eyes. Her love for him had always been a silent, selfless thing. Now, it had to be a secret as well. She watched him fall in love with a woman made of paper and ink, and every day, she buried her own heart a little deeper in the red dust of her grief. The correspondence continued for months. Winter thawed into a brief, muddy spring, which then gave way to the relentless heat of summer. Elias's image of Lila was now fully formed, a beacon of hope in his solitary world. She represented a second chance, a life not defined by loss. He had fallen in love not with a woman, but with an idea, the idea of a wife, a family, a future. One evening, emboldened by the whiskey he'd been sipping and the profound loneliness of the coming night, he wrote the most important letter of all. His words were simple, direct, and stripped of all poetry. They were the words of a man making a serious, life-altering proposal. "Miss Quincy," he wrote, "I am a plain man and do not have a way with words, but I am an honest one. I have a good ranch and I can provide for a wife. My house is empty, and I would be honored if you would consent to fill it. I am asking you to be my wife." He sealed the envelope and sent it off the next morning with a sense of trepidation and finality. For weeks, the silence in his house felt heavier than ever. He and Clara moved around each other with an unspoken tension crackling in the air between them. She knew what was in that letter without him ever saying a word. Then the reply came. It was a single sheet of paper. Elias's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The words were few, but they held the weight of a life's decision. She accepted his proposal. She would sell her few belongings, buy a train ticket, and begin the long journey west. She was leaving everything she had ever known for a man she had never met and a land she had only seen in her dreams. For Lila Quincy, standing in the grimy, soot-stained street of her factory town, the letter was a pardon. It was her escape from a past that clung to her like a shroud. A past marred by a quiet, terrible violation she had never spoken of to anyone. That secret shame was the true prison she was fleeing. Elias's letter was not just a proposal of marriage. It was a promise of a place where no one knew her, where she could wash herself clean in the dust of the West and perhaps, finally, become someone new. With a heart full of fragile hope and a past full of wounds, she prepared to journey toward the unforgiving sun and into the lives of a man who loved her letters and a woman who had been loving him in silence all along. The train arrived in Redemption with a great sigh of steam and a groan of metal, a monstrous iron beast panting in the oppressive midday heat. It was the only thing that moved with any sense of urgency in the dusty, sun-drowsed town. Lila Quincy stepped down from the carriage and onto the wooden platform, feeling as though she had disembarked onto a different planet. The air was thin and dry, smelling of dust, horse, and something wild she couldn't name. It was a stark contrast to the damp, coal-scented air of her Massachusetts home. She clutched her single, worn carpet bag, the handle slick in her nervous palm, and felt very small under the vast, bleached blue sky. She was a creature of soft edges in a land of sharp lines. Her dress, a modest gray poplin she had sewn herself, was already filmed with the ubiquitous red dust. Her skin, pale from years spent indoors, felt tight and scorched after only a few moments in the sun. But it was her eyes that truly set her apart. They were the color of a stormy sea, large and shadowed, holding a history that made her seem older than her 20 years. It was a vulnerability she tried to hide behind a mask of quiet composure, a practiced stillness she had perfected long ago. In her heart, a desperate hope battled with a deep, ingrained fear. This place, this man, was her only chance. She had journeyed 1,000 miles to escape the memory of a back-alley encounter that had stolen her voice and her trust in the world. She prayed this stark, silent land would be the place she could finally find them again. Then she saw him. He stood apart from the small cluster of men waiting on the platform, a tall, broad-shouldered figure who seemed as rooted in the landscape as the weathered timbers of the station itself. Elias Thorne. He was dressed in a clean but well-worn suit that seemed to constrain him. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over in a gesture of uncharacteristic unease. As he spotted her, he stopped fidgeting. His eyes, a surprisingly clear gray, met hers across the dusty expanse. He was handsome in a rugged, severe way that the letters had not prepared her for. The man who had written of sunsets and wildflowers was nowhere to be seen in the hard lines of his face or the guarded set of his jaw. This was a man made of the same unforgiving material as the land around him. "Miss Quincy?" he asked, his voice a low baritone, rougher than she had imagined. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. She cursed her shyness, the way her throat closed up when she was nervous. He took her bag from her, his large, calloused hand brushing hers. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her. It was the first time a man had touched her in 2 years who wasn't her brother or her father. He was real. This was all real. Elias felt a disquieting sense of confusion. The woman in the letters had been witty, her words painting pictures in his mind. She had a spirit that seemed to dance off the page. This woman, this girl, seemed as fragile as a sparrow, ready to take flight at any sudden movement. Her beauty was undeniable, a delicate, pale flower in the middle of the desert. But her presence was so muted, so intensely shy, it threw him off balance. He was a man of routines and predictable outcomes. Lila Quincy, in the flesh, was an unforeseen complication. "The wagon is this way," he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. He led her away from the station, the awkward silence stretching between them like a taut wire. From the shaded doorway of the general store across the street, Clara Mayhew watched them. She had told herself she was only in town for flour and thread, a lie so thin it was transparent even to her. Her heart, which she had thought was numb after years of practice, felt as if it were being squeezed in a vice. She saw the way Elias took Lila's bag, the careful, almost gentle way he guided her toward the wagon. It was a simple courtesy, the kind any man would offer a woman, but to Clara, it was a spectacle of exquisite pain. She had worked alongside him for years, hefting sacks of grain and buckets of water, and he had never once offered such a gesture. Theirs was a partnership of equals, of fellow survivors. What he was offering this newcomer was something else entirely. Protection, deference, the kind a man offers his wife. Her hand tightened on the handle of her shopping basket, the wicker creaking in protest. She saw Lila look up at Elias, her face a mixture of hope and fear. And in that moment, Clara felt a surge of something ugly and unfamiliar, a bitter, burning jealousy. She had loved this man through his darkest grief, tended to his home and his heart in silence. And here was a stranger, a girl from a world away, stepping into the life that Clara had only ever dared to dream of. She slipped back into the shadows of the store before they could see her. A ghost at the wedding feast. The bell above the door chimed softly, a sound like a tiny, breaking heart. The ride to the ranch was long and quiet. Elias pointed out landmarks, the distant mesa, the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek, but his commentary was sparse, factual. Lila sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, her hands folded primly in her lap, her eyes taking in the vast, intimidating emptiness of it all. It was beautiful, in a brutal, lonely way. It felt like the end of the world. She tried to think of something to say, something to bridge the chasm of silence between them, but the words wouldn't come. She was a stranger in a strange land, sitting next to a man who was a stranger to her, on their way to a life they were supposed to build together. The sheer impossibility of it all was overwhelming. When they finally arrived at the ranch, the house stood sturdy and defiant against the setting sun. As Elias led her inside, Lila was surprised. The interior was spotless, the floor swept clean, the air smelling of beeswax and fresh-baked bread. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, chasing away the evening chill, and a pot of stew bubbled invitingly on the stove. It was a welcoming sight, but it was also a puzzle. The home was impeccably kept, with a woman's touch evident in the neatly patched curtains and the folded quilt on the back of a chair. "It's lovely," Lila said, the first genuine words she had managed. Mrs. Mayhew tidied up," Elias said, his tone matter-of-fact as he set her bag down. "The widow I wrote you of. She helps out." Lila's brow furrowed slightly. A hired hand? The care taken with this house felt like more than a job. It felt personal, but she was too tired and overwhelmed to dwell on it. Elias showed her to the bedroom. It was a simple room, dominated by a large, sturdy bed frame made of dark wood. The bed was made with fresh, clean-smelling linens, and a simple clay jar holding a spray of delicate, pale purple wildflowers sat on the nightstand. This was Clara's final act of service, and her most painful. She had spent the morning in this room, the room Elias had once shared with his first wife. Mary. She had aired out the mattress, washed the linens with lye soap and lavender, and scrubbed the floorboards on her hands and knees. Every movement was a prayer and a penance. She was preparing the bridal chamber for her beloved and another woman. She had picked the wildflowers from a sheltered spot by the creek, the only place they grew. As she set them by the bedside, a single tear had escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She had wiped it away angrily, an invisible woman preparing a space she would never occupy. Lila ran a hand over the smooth, cool fabric of the quilt. "She is very thorough," she said quietly. Elias simply nodded, oblivious to the layers of meaning contained in the simple room. The first few days passed in a haze of awkward adjustment. Elias and Lila were like two planets that had been forced into the same orbit, circling each other cautiously, unsure of the gravitational pull between them. Their meals were quiet affairs, the silence broken only by the clink of silverware against tin plates. He would try to talk about the ranch, about the work that needed doing, but the language of his life, of branding and calving and mending fences, was foreign to her. She would try to talk about books she had read or the life she had known, but it seemed trivial and flimsy in the face of this raw, demanding existence. There was an undeniable admiration between them. Lila watched him work, his movements powerful and efficient, and saw a strength and capability that made her feel safe for the first time in years. He was a good man, a solid man. Elias, in turn, saw in Lila a quiet grace and a surprising resilience. She did not complain about the hardships. She learned quickly, helping in the kitchen, tending the small chicken coop, her movements becoming less hesitant with each passing day. But there was no true connection. The easy intimacy of their letters was gone, replaced by the stiff formality of two strangers sharing a roof. He was gruff and withdrawn, retreating into silence whenever he felt unsure. She was timid and watchful, her past having taught her that a man's silence could be a prelude to a storm. She would flinch if he moved too quickly, and her quietness would often stretch for hours. Her thoughts turned inward to places he could not follow. It was during these moments that Elias's gaze would drift toward the horizon, in the direction of Clara's cabin. Clara, trying to be respectful, made herself scarce. She stopped her daily visits, wanting to give the newlyweds space to find their footing. But her absence created a void that Elias felt keenly. The comfortable, easy silence he had shared with Clara was nothing like the tense, heavy silence he now shared with his wife. He found himself missing the simple, unspoken companionship, the way she knew what he needed before he did. One afternoon, Lila was sitting on the porch, trying to mend one of Elias's shirts, her stitches small and uneven. Elias was across the yard, trying to fix a broken harness, his frustration mounting with every failed attempt. The silence between them was thick with things unsaid. Just then, Clara appeared, walking across the field from her cabin. She was carrying a small basket. "Elias," she called out, her voice calm and clear. "I thought you might have use for this. My Thomas was always breaking harnesses." She pulled out a specialized leatherworking tool. Lila watched as a remarkable transformation came over her husband. The hard lines of his face softened, the tension in his shoulders eased. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile Lila had never seen directed at her. "Clara," he said, and his voice was different, warmer. "You're a lifesaver." He took the tool, and for a moment, they stood talking quietly. Lila couldn't hear the words, but she could see the way they stood, the easy familiarity in their postures. She watched the way Elias looked at Clara. It was not the way a man looked at his hired hand. It was a look of deep reliance, of shared history. It was a look that said, "You understand." Lila's hand stilled, the needle poised in midair. A cold knot of suspicion began to form in her stomach. "The widow I wrote you of, she helps out." The words echoed in her mind, now sounding hollow and false. This was not a helper. this was something more. After that day, Lila began to watch. She became a student of glances and gestures, of silences and tones. She noticed how, whenever a conversation with her faltered, Elias's eyes would instinctively search the room, as if expecting to find someone else there. She noticed how he would find excuses to go to the barn in the late afternoons, the time Clara used to come by. "Just checking on the horses," he'd say. But he'd come back seeming calmer. His mood settled. He was seeking a comfort that Lila, with her skittishness and her silences, could not provide. He was fleeing the unfamiliar quiet of his new wife for the familiar quiet of the woman next door. The tension in the small house grew, unspoken but palpable. Lila retreated further into herself, her suspicion building a wall around her. She was polite, she was dutiful, but she was a ghost in her own marriage, haunted by the presence of a woman who was rarely even there. Elias, in turn, grew more frustrated. He had wanted a wife to fill the emptiness of his house, but somehow it felt emptier than ever. He didn't understand her moods, her sudden withdrawals. He only knew that the woman he was married to was not the woman from the letters. The breaking point came one moonless night, about a month after her arrival. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick and electric. Lila lay awake in the large bed, listening to the sound of the wind beginning to rise outside. Elias slept beside her, a warm, solid presence that felt a million miles away. He was a stranger, breathing in her ear. She had never grown used to sharing a bed. Every night was an exercise in rigid self-control, lying perfectly still, praying he wouldn't touch her. The memory of unwelcome hands was never far from her mind. He had been a gentleman, never pressing her for the physical intimacy of marriage, seeming to understand her unspoken fear, but his patience only made her feel more like a fraud. Tonight, he was restless. He tossed in his sleep, his breathing uneven. He began to murmur, the words thick and indistinct. Lila turned her head on the pillow, her body tense. She listened, her heart starting to pound against her ribs. Most of it was nonsense, fragments of dreams about cattle or the war. But then, he grew still. The house was silent save for the moaning of the wind. In that silence, he spoke one word, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. "Clara?" It was not a shout. It was a sigh, a plea, a name spoken with a desperate, heartbreaking softness, as if he were reaching for a lifeline in the dark. The sound hung in the air, echoing in the profound stillness of the room. For Lila, it was a confirmation of every doubt, every fear, every suspicion she had harbored. The cold knot in her stomach tightened into a knot of pure ice. She was the bride. She was his wife. She lay in his bed, but the name he spoke in the dark, the name that came from the deepest part of his heart, was not hers. She lay there for the rest of the night, staring into the darkness, the wind howling outside the window like a lonely, grieving soul. For the first time, she understood. She had not come to the West to fill an empty house. She had come to fill a space that was already occupied. The name spoken in the dark became a third person in the marriage, a silent, watchful presence that permeated every corner of the small house. In the days that followed, an undeclared war began between Lila and Clara, a conflict fought not with raised voices or angry words, but in the vast, treacherous territory of silence. It was a war of glances held a second too long, of polite smiles that did not reach the eyes, of doors closed a little too quickly. Lila, now armed with the certainty of her suspicion, became an observer. She watched the way Clara's hands, rough and capable, knew exactly where everything was in Elias's kitchen without having to look. She noticed how Clara would mend a tear in Elias's shirt with the same neat, invisible stitches that Mary, his first wife, had used, a detail she discovered one day while sorting laundry. It was a stitch of profound intimacy, a silent continuation of a life Lila had no part in. When Clara spoke to Elias, her voice had a low, easy cadence, a comfortable rhythm built over years of shared sunrises and hardships. When she spoke to Lila, her voice was carefully polite, her words chosen with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. Clara, for her part, felt Lila's scrutiny like a physical weight. She tried to make her presence at the ranch briefer, more functional. She would deliver a freshly baked pie and retreat before Lila could even offer her a cup of coffee. She would check on the horses, her movements brisk and purposeful, avoiding the house altogether. But the ranch was a small world, and their orbits were destined to collide. One morning, Lila was attempting to light the stove, her city-bred hands fumbling with the kindling. After several frustrating minutes, Clara, who had entered silently to drop off a jar of preserves, stepped forward. "The flue needs to be open a little wider," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She reached past Lila, her arm brushing Lila's shoulder, and adjusted the lever. The fire caught immediately, roaring to life. "It's tricky in this wind." Lila stepped back, her face flushing with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight. The simple act felt like a demonstration of her own inadequacy, another piece of evidence that this home recognized Clara as its true mistress. Clara merely nodded, placed the jar on the table, and left. The silence she left behind even heavier than before. The fragile peace shattered a week later, on a trip to Redemption. Elias needed to speak to the blacksmith about a new plowshare and, in a rare attempt at husbandly inclusion, suggested Lila ride in with him. While Elias was occupied in the smoky heat of the smithy, Lila went to the general store for thread and sugar. The store was the town's social hub, and as Lila browsed the shelves, she became aware of the low murmur of two women talking near the fabric bolts. They were Mrs. Gable, the portly wife of the store's owner, and a thin, hawk-faced woman whose name Lila didn't know. Their voices were pitched just low enough to feign privacy, but just loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "And now he's married that little mail-order thing," the hawk-faced woman said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Pale as a ghost. Looks like a strong wind would blow her over." "Hush now, Elspeth," Mrs. Gable chided, though without any real force. "It's his business. Still, you have to feel for Clara Mayhew. Lord knows she's earned her place at that ranch." "Earned it? She's been clinging to that man since her own was in the ground." Elspeth sniffed. "Following him around like a stray. Everyone knows she's been in love with him for years, but he never looked twice, too busy grieving his precious Mary. Now he just keeps her around to do the work. It's a pity. Is what it is. A woman shouldn't abase herself so—" Lila froze, her hand hovering over a spool of white thread. Every word was a hammer blow, validating the shapeless fear that had been growing in her heart. Everyone knows. It wasn't just her imagination. It was a known fact, a piece of town lore. She was the outsider, the intruder in a long-running drama. She felt a wave of hot, suffocating shame, as if their words were about her, painting her as the fool who had walked blindly into another woman's story. She grabbed her thread, paid with trembling hands, and fled the store, the women's quiet laughter following her out into the blinding sunlight. The gossip, like a prairie fire, eventually found its way to its subject. It was Mrs. Gable who delivered the final, fatal spark, catching Clara outside the store a few days later. "Clara, dear," she began, her face a mask of false sympathy. "People are talking about you and the Thorns. A new wife needs her own space. You know, perhaps it would be best to step back." The unspoken accusation hung in the air. "You are a shameless woman trying to steal a husband." For Clara, who had endured so much with quiet fortitude, this public humiliation was the final indignity. The whispers she had ignored for years had now become a direct assault. She felt stripped bare in the middle of the dusty street, her private, painful love laid out for public consumption and judgment. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her small, silent cabin, the ghosts of her husband and son watching her from the shadows, and made a decision. She could not stay here. She could not watch the man she loved build a life with another woman while a whole town pitied and scorned her. The next morning, she packed. It didn't take long. Her life fit into a single wooden trunk, Thomas's worn Bible, a tiny pair of Samuel's scuffed leather shoes, a few patched dresses, and a chipped photograph of the three of them, smiling in the sun. Each item was a relic of a life that no longer existed. She was a ghost, and it was time to move on. She walked to Elias's ranch for the last time, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She found him in the corral, brushing down Apollo. He saw her approach and gave her a small, easy smile. The smile he reserved only for her. "Clara, I was just thinking of you," he said. "The bay mare's looking a little lame." "Elias, I've come to say goodbye," she said, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. He stopped brushing and turned to face her fully, his smile vanishing. "Goodbye? What are you talking about? Are you going on a trip?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm leaving. Leaving redemption. I'm thinking of heading north, maybe to Oregon. I have a distant cousin there." He stared at her, his face a mask of utter incomprehension. The idea was so foreign, so outside the realm of his reality, that he couldn't process it. Clara was a part of this place, a part of his life. She was as constant as the sunrise. "Leave! Why in God's name would you do that?" he demanded. She couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't say, "Because I love you, and watching you with her is killing me." She couldn't say, "Because the whole town is calling me your pathetic shadow." So she said nothing, just looked at the ground. His incomprehension turned to a kind of panicked pragmatism. He wasn't equipped to handle the emotional undercurrents of the situation, so he grasped for the practical. "But the horses," he said, the words sounding lame even to his own ears. "Apollo, he won't let anyone else near him when he's sick, and you're the only one who knows how to mix that poultice for his leg. I need you here. Clara." He saw it as a simple, logical fact. He needed her. The ranch needed her. He was completely blind to the real reason he couldn't let her go. The thought of his world without her steady, quiet presence in it was terrifying, unimaginable. He wasn't losing a helper. He was losing his anchor. Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness. He was holding her here for the horses. He was tying her to this place of pain with the chains of his own oblivious needs. And the most heartbreaking part was that she knew she would stay. Her love for him was a sickness, and she was too weak to walk away from the cause. "All right, Elias," she whispered. "I'll stay. For the horses." That night, the sky began to change. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an oppressive, electric energy. By late afternoon, the horizon was a bruise of purple and black, and the wind began to moan, a low, keening sound that promised violence, a summer storm, one of the brutal, sudden squalls that could tear across the plains with biblical fury, was coming. Elias and Lila worked to secure the ranch, their movements hurried and silent. They shuttered the windows and latched the barn doors, the tension of the coming storm mirroring the unspoken tempest inside the house. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, a crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening roar of thunder. In the corral, a young colt, not yet a year old, panicked. It reared, its eyes white with terror, and with a desperate surge of strength, smashed through a weak section of the fence and bolted out into the open plains, straight into the teeth of the storm. "Damn fool horse!" Elias swore. Without a second thought, he grabbed a rope and ran to saddle Apollo, his most trusted mount. "Elias, no!" Lila cried, grabbing his arm. "It's too dangerous! Just let it go!" He shook her off, his face set in a grim, determined line. "I'm not losing a horse to this storm." He swung into the saddle and spurred Apollo out into the driving rain, disappearing into the swirling gray chaos. Lila was left alone in the barn. The sound of the rain on the roof like 1,000 frantic drums. She was terrified. She understood his need to save the animal. Everything on this ranch was hard-won and precious, but his disregard for his own safety was incomprehensible to her. An hour passed, then another. The storm raged, the wind howling like a banshee. Just as the worst of the storm began to subside, she saw him. He was staggering toward the house, leaning heavily on Apollo, his face pale as death. His left leg was covered in blood, and there was a dark, ugly gash on his temple. He collapsed in the mud just a few feet from the porch. Lila screamed and ran to him. He was conscious, but barely. "A falling branch, the colt kicked out," he mumbled, his words slurred. She tried to move him, but he was too heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Panic, cold and paralyzing, seized her, the sight of his blood, the unnatural stillness of this powerful man, threw her back into the dark alley of her memory. She was helpless, a frightened girl facing a violence she couldn't comprehend. She knelt beside him in the mud, calling his name over and over, her hands fluttering uselessly, not knowing where to touch, what to do. It was then that Clara appeared. She had seen the broken fence from her cabin, had known in her bones that Elias would go after the colt. She ran through the waning storm, her skirts soaked and heavy, her heart pounding with a terrible premonition. She took in the scene at a glance. Elias on the ground, Lila kneeling beside him, frozen in a state of terrified inaction. Clara became a force of calm efficiency. "Lila, get inside, put every kettle you have on the stove to boil, and bring me clean rags. All you can find. Now!" she commanded, her voice cutting through Lila's panic like a knife. Lila, grateful for the direction, scrambled to obey. While she was gone, Clara, with a strength born of desperation, managed to drag Elias onto the porch, out of the mud. She tore a long strip from her own petticoat and tied a crude but effective tourniquet above the deep, bleeding gash on his leg. Her hands were steady, her mind clear. She had nursed her husband and son through their final, fevered days. Death did not frighten her. They got him inside and onto his bed. The room quickly filled with the metallic scent of blood and the steam from the boiling water. Clara worked with a focused intensity that was breathtaking to watch. She cleaned the wound on his leg, her touch gentle but firm, assessing the damage. She stitched the ragged edges of the cut together with a needle and thread from Lila's sewing basket, her movements as precise as a surgeon's. She gently cleaned the head wound, her fingers probing for any sign of a fracture. Lila stood by, a useless spectator. She brought the water and the rags, but she was a stranger in this crisis. Clara knew his body, knew the landscape of his scars. She moved as if she had done this 1,000 times, and Lila realized with a sickening lurch that she probably had. In spirit, if not in practice, she had been tending to his wounds, visible and invisible, for years. Elias drifted in and out of a feverish delirium. He muttered about the war, about his first wife, Mary. Clara continued to bathe his head with a cool cloth, murmuring to him in a low, soothing voice. Lila watched from the doorway, feeling like an intruder in her own home. Sometime late in the night, Elias's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, clouded with pain and fever. He looked around wildly for a moment, then his hands shot out, grabbing for Clara's. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Clara," he breathed, his voice a hoarse, desperate rasp. Don't leave me! Clara, don't go!" The words, torn from the deepest, most honest part of his unconscious mind, struck Lila with the force of a physical blow. She made a small, choked sound, a sob that was swallowed by the quiet hum of the house. This was not a name in a dream. This was a plea, a raw and desperate confession. She turned and fled the room, her own heart bleeding from a wound no one could see or stitch. In the bedroom, Clara's carefully constructed composure finally broke. Tears she hadn't even known she was holding back began to stream down her face, falling onto the hand that gripped hers so tightly. A terrible, conflicting wave of emotion washed over her. There was a surge of profound, heartbreaking joy. He had said it. His heart had finally spoken its truth. But it was followed immediately by the devastating agony of the situation. He only reached for her when he was broken. He only saw her when his eyes were closed. Later, much later, the house settled into a deep, exhausted quiet. Elias was sleeping, his fever slightly down, his breathing even. Lila found Clara sitting in a chair by the hearth, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Her face was pale and drawn in the flickering light, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The pretense between them was gone, burned away by the crisis. There was nothing left but the raw, unavoidable truth. Lila walked across the room and stood before her. Her own voice was quiet, stripped of all artifice, holding only a hollowed-out need to know. "When?" Lila asked. "When did you start loving him?" Clara didn't look up from the fire for a long moment. She seemed to be considering the question, not as an accusation, but as a genuine inquiry into a long and painful history. Finally, she raised her eyes to meet Lila's. They were filled not with guilt or triumph, but with an ancient, bottomless sorrow. "Since I was a person with a heart," she said softly. The fever broke as dawn stretched thin, gray fingers across the plains. Elias Thorne awoke to a world that seemed both muted and unnervingly sharp. The throbbing in his head had subsided to a dull ache, and the fire in his leg was banked to embers. He felt weak, hollowed out, but his mind was clear for the first time in what felt like days. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It was a different quality of silence than the one he was used to. His house had always been quiet, but it had been a comfortable, settled quiet. This was a silence of taut wires and held breath, a silence that vibrated with unspoken words. He saw both women, moving like wraiths in the dim morning light. Lila brought him a bowl of thin broth, her movements graceful but remote. She placed it on the bedside table without meeting his eyes, her face a pale, lovely mask of detached courtesy. "You should eat," she said, her voice soft and devoid of any emotion. Then she was gone. A little later, Clara came in to check the dressing on his leg. Her hands, as always, were gentle and sure, but she worked with a grim, focused efficiency that allowed for no personal connection. She, too, avoided his gaze, her attention fixed entirely on her task. When she finished, she stood to leave. "Clara, wait," he said, his voice raspy. She paused at the door, her back to him. "You need to rest, Elias." "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "For everything." She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. He was alone, but the weight of their combined presence was suffocating. He was a man accustomed to navigating the clear, honest dangers of the land, this terrain of female emotion, of subtle cues and charged atmospheres, was a foreign country to him, and he was hopelessly lost. In the days that followed, a strange, suffocating routine set in. Both women tended to his needs with a chilling, impersonal efficiency. They were like two nuns caring for a patient, their duty performed with solemn grace but without a shred of warmth or intimacy. They moved around each other with a wide, careful berth, never speaking directly. Their communication a series of gestures and assumptions. The house became a pressure cooker of resentment and sorrow. And Elias, lying helpless in his bed, was trapped in the middle of it. Finally, when he was strong enough to sit in a chair by the hearth, he could bear it no longer. Lila was sweeping the floor, her back to him, her movements stiff and deliberate. Clara was nowhere to be seen. "Lila," he said, his voice firm, "look at me." She stopped sweeping but did not turn. "I am busy. Elias." "What is wrong in this house?" he demanded. "Why are you both treating me like a stranger?" She finally turned, her broom held before her like a shield. Her eyes, usually so timid, were now clear and cold as a winter sky. There was no anger in them, only a profound and weary finality. "There is nothing wrong in the house," she said, her voice even. "The truth has simply decided to live here with us." "What truth? What are you talking about?" he asked, his frustration mounting. A small, sad smile touched her lips, a flicker of pity that enraged him. "You wrote your letters to one woman, Elias," she said softly, "but you gave your heart to another." "It is as simple and as terrible as that." The accusation struck him with the force of a physical blow. He gaped at her, momentarily speechless. That's nonsense," he finally stammered, a tide of angry denial rising in him. "Clara is my neighbor, my friend. She helped me after Mary died. You are my wife." He said the word wife, as if it were an irrefutable fact, a trump card that should end all discussion. Lila did not flinch. She simply looked at him with that same unnerving, sorrowful clarity. "Your mouth says I am your wife. Your letters said you wanted me to be your wife, but your heart, even in your dreams, calls her name." She turned back to her sweeping, the rhythmic scrape of the broom on the floorboards the only sound. The conversation was over. Her judgment was delivered. He sat there, fuming, his mind rejecting her words as the jealous fantasy of a spurned woman. Clara, the idea was absurd. Clara was Clara. She was a fixture, a part of the landscape of his life, as familiar and as taken for granted as the well from which he drew his water. But as his anger cooled, Lila's words began to echo in the quiet room, burrowing into his mind like termites into wood. "Your heart calls her name." He closed his eyes and, for the first time, he let himself truly think about the past 5 years. He didn't just remember Clara, he allowed himself to see her. He saw her standing on his porch a week after Mary's funeral, holding a pot of stew, her own face still etched with the raw grief of her own recent losses. She hadn't said much, just pushed the pot into his numb hands and said, "You have to eat, Elias." He saw her in the dead of winter, her face wrapped in a shawl against the biting wind, coming over to help him birth a calf, her small hands working with a strength and confidence that matched his own. They had worked together through the night, a silent, perfectly synchronized team, and had shared a flask of whiskey in the hay as the sun came up. A moment of profound, unspoken communion. He remembered countless evenings, sitting by this very fire, he with his ledgers and she with her mending. The silence between them so full of understanding it was more comforting than any conversation. He remembered the way she smiled when he finally fixed the crooked fence post, the way she knew where he kept every tool in his barn, the way her presence had slowly, methodically, and without his notice, filled the gaping, ragged hole that Mary's death had left behind. He had called her a friend. He had called her a helper. He had reduced her to a hired hand in his letters to Lila. He felt a hot flush of shame. He had been a blind man. He had mistaken the sun for a candle. He had believed he was alone, all the while being held together by the quiet, constant, and utterly selfless devotion of this woman. She had never asked for anything, never demanded a single word of love or acknowledgement. She had simply been there, giving him everything she had left to give. And he, in his ignorance, had brought another woman here to take her place. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. Lila wasn't jealous. She was right. A sudden, terrifying thought seized him. Clara, the tension in the house, Lila's accusation. Clara must have heard it. He stood up, his leg protesting with a sharp stab of pain, and looked wildly around. Her shawl was gone from its usual peg by the door. He limped to the window and looked out toward her cabin. He saw her. She was halfway across the field, carrying the small wooden trunk he had seen her use once or twice to bring things from town. She wasn't walking toward him. She was walking away, toward the faint track that led to the main road, toward redemption, away from him. A primal panic, cold and sharp, shot through him. He threw open the door and stumbled out onto the porch, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. "Clara!" he bellowed, his voice raw. She stopped but did not turn around. He hobbled down the steps and across the yard, his limp pronounced, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get to her. He had to stop her. The world without her in it suddenly seemed like a flat, colorless void. He caught up to her at the edge of his property, where his fence met the open range. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of her sleeve. "Where are you going?" he demanded. His voice choked. "Let me go, Elias," she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. She still wouldn't look at him. "No," he said. He moved to stand in front of her, forcing her to face him. And then, for the first time, they truly looked at each other. All the years of pretense, of carefully maintained boundaries and unspoken truths, fell away. He was not the grieving widower, and she was not the helpful neighbor. He saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. The deep, abiding love in her sorrowful eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, the pain she had carried for him, because of him, for so long. And in his eyes, she saw not pity or need, but a raw, dawning terror of loss. She saw the man beneath the scars, a man as lonely and lost as she was. In that one, silent, cataclysmic moment, they were just a man and a woman who had orbited each other's grief for years, finally seeing the truth that had been between them all along. He didn't know what to say. Words were useless, inadequate. So he did the only thing he could. He pulled her to him, and he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of discovery, of 5 years of unspoken gratitude and unacknowledged longing crashing together in one explosive, devastating moment. It was a kiss that tasted of regret and storms and the dusty, unforgiving land that had forged them both. It was the truest thing he had ever done. On the porch of the house, Lila stood, a still, silent statue. She had watched him run after Clara, and she watched now as her husband kissed another woman in the open sunlight. For the whole world to see. She did not gasp. She did not cry. Her face remained a mask of calm resignation. It was not a surprise. It was merely a confirmation. A painful, public punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she had already read. For Clara, the kiss was both a miracle and a curse. To feel his lips on hers was a dream she had ruthlessly suppressed for years, a sudden, shocking burst of light in her gray world. But the light illuminated the wreckage of their lives. He was married. She was kissing another woman's husband. This was not a beginning. It was an end. With a cry that was half sob, half protest, she tore her mouth from his, pushed him away with all her strength, and ran. She left her trunk where it lay and fled, not toward the road, but toward the shelter of her own empty cabin, her heart shattering with every step. Lila watched her go. Then she turned, her movements calm and deliberate, and walked back into the house. She went to the bedroom, the bridal chamber that Clara had prepared with such heartbreaking care, and closed the door. She sat at the small, plain desk, took out the neat stack of paper and the inkwell she had brought with her from the East, and began to write. The letters that had been her passage into this life would now be her passage out. Elias was left standing alone in the middle of the field, his hands still tingling from the ghost of her arm, his lips still burning from the ghost of her kiss. The wind picked up, swirling the red dust around his boots. He looked toward Clara's cabin, where she had fled from him, a closed door hiding her pain. Then he looked back at his own house, where his wife had retreated behind another closed door, sealing herself away with his betrayal. He stood in the vast, empty space between them. A man caught between the woman he was bound to by law and the woman he was bound to by a truth he had only just learned. He was a king in a kingdom of his own making, and all he had managed to do was destroy everyone in it. Most of all, himself. News of the kiss traveled faster than a prairie fire. It swept through the town of Redemption on whispers and sanctimonious sighs, passed from the general store to the church steps, from the blacksmith's forge to the sewing circle. The narrative was simple, brutal, and satisfying to the town's puritanical palate. The patient, predatory widow, Clara Mayhew, had finally snared her man, and the poor, innocent mail-order bride, Lila Thorne, was the tragic victim. The women of the town, who had long viewed Clara's quiet independence as a reproach to their own constrained lives, now saw their chance to pass judgment. Her grief was forgotten, her years of solitary dignity erased. She was a Jezebel, a husband-stealer. The judgment was not content to remain as words. One evening, as Clara sat in her small cabin, a prisoner of her own misery, a rock smashed through her window, shattering the precious pane of glass and sending a spray of sharp fragments across her floor. It was followed by another, "Husband-stealer!" A boy's voice, cracking with adolescent bravado, yelled from the darkness. "Get out of our town!" another shouted. Clara scrambled back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She huddled in the corner of the room, making herself as small as possible, as more stones rained down against the wooden walls of her home. They didn't dare show their faces, but their voices, filled with a righteous, borrowed fury, were a terrifying assault. Each stone felt as if it were striking her own body. Each shouted insult a confirmation of her deepest shame. She was an outcast, a pariah. The home that had been her sanctuary through years of grief was now a fragile shell under siege. Elias heard about it the next morning. He rode into town for salt and heard the story from the blacksmith, who recounted it with a grim neutrality. But Elias saw the smirks on the faces of the men loitering outside the saloon, and he saw the tight, satisfied smiles on the women he passed on the street. A cold, hard rage, the likes of which he hadn't felt since the war, settled in his chest. He turned his horse around without a word and rode directly to Clara's cabin. The sight of the broken window, the shards of glass glittering in the morning sun, and the cruel rocks scattered on the ground turned his rage to ice. He dismounted and strode to the door. Calling her name, there was no answer. He pushed the door open and found her inside, sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked broken, a fragile thing that the world had finally managed to crush. Something inside him shifted, solidifying from guilt and confusion into a single, unshakable purpose. He had done this to her. His blindness, his carelessness, his selfish need had exposed her to this, and he would be the one to fix it. "Pack your things," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with an authority that allowed for no argument. "What?" she whispered, looking up at him with hollow eyes. "Everything you own. We're leaving." Without waiting for a reply, he began to gather her belongings. He was gentle but ruthlessly efficient. He packed her mother's china, her husband's books, the small, pitiful trunk of her clothes. He worked in silence, and she watched him, too stunned and exhausted to protest. When everything was packed, he loaded it onto his wagon, which he had brought back from his own ranch. He did it all in the open, in the full light of day, a deliberate and defiant act for any curious eyes to see. Then he went back inside and gently but firmly pulled her to her feet. "You're coming home," he said. He led her out to the wagon and helped her up onto the seat. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the windows of the neighboring homesteads. Let them watch. Let the whole damn town watch. He was done with hiding, done with lies of convenience, done with pretending his world could function without the woman sitting beside him. He was drawing a line in the red dust, and Clara was on his side of it. He slapped the reins, and the wagon moved forward, carrying them toward the ranch, toward a future he could not yet imagine but was now determined to claim. The arrival of Clara as a permanent resident plunged the ranch house into a new state of unbearable tension. The three of them were now trapped under one roof, orbiting each other in a miserable, silent dance. Lila confined herself to her bedroom, emerging only for meals, which she ate quickly and without a word. Clara, consumed with shame and feeling like an intruder, tried to make herself invisible, taking on the hardest chores in the barn and the field, staying out of the house as much as possible. Elias was caught between them, the source of all their pain, his presence a constant, throbbing ache in the heart of their small, broken world. This fragile, miserable state of affairs could not last. A few days after Clara's arrival, a quiet confrontation finally broke the silence. Lila came into the kitchen to find Clara scrubbing the floor, her movements harsh and frantic, as if she could scour away her own guilt. For a long moment, the only sound was the scrape of Clara's brush against the wood. Lila watched her, her heart a tangled knot of pity and resentment. Finally, Lila spoke, her voice startlingly soft in the quiet room. "You don't have to do that." Clara froze, her shoulders tensing. "The floor is dirty," she said without turning around. "It can wait," Lila insisted. She pulled out a chair from the kitchen table. "Please, sit with me." Hesitantly, as if expecting a blow, Clara rose and wiped her hands on her apron. She sat opposite Lila, the table between them feeling as wide as a canyon. For the first time since the crisis began, the two women truly looked at each other, not as rivals, but as two human beings caught in an impossible trap. It was Lila who broke the silence, her confession a quiet, sorrowful whisper. "I never should have come here," she began, her gaze fixed on her hands, folded tightly on the table. "When I read Mr. Thorne's letters, I didn't see a man. I saw an escape, a way out." She took a shaky breath, the words of her secret history finally rising to the surface. "My life back east, it was not a good life. My family was poor, but it was more than that. There was an incident, an encounter with a man from the mill. He cornered me one evening. What he did, it made me feel like I was nothing, worthless, unclean. I began to feel like a ghost in my own life. I stopped speaking unless I had to. I was so afraid." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Elias's letters were a lifeline. He wrote of this vast, empty land, and I thought it was a place big enough to lose my past in, a place where no one knew what had happened to me, where I could be clean again. He offered me a home and protection. That's all I wanted. I needed a safe harbor. I was just so desperate to feel safe. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting Clara's. "I never loved him," she said, the admission both a betrayal and a liberation. "Not the way you do. I don't think I even know what that is. I only ever loved the idea of him, the idea of a quiet, strong man who could keep the world away." "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry I walked into the middle of your life. I was just trying to save my own." Clara listened, her heart aching with a profound, sorrowful empathy. The image she had held of Lila, the beautiful, fragile interloper, dissolved, replaced by the image of a wounded, desperate girl. She saw not a rival, but a fellow survivor, another woman who had been broken by the world and was just trying to piece herself back together. Clara reached across the table and, for the first time, touched Lila's hand. Her own voice was thick with emotion when she spoke. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said. "It is I who should be sorry. I never wanted to cause you pain." She pulled her hand back, her own confession tumbling out. "I have loved him for so long. I don't remember a time when I didn't, after my Thomas and my Samuel died. Elias was the only thing that kept me from drifting away completely. Coming here, helping him, it gave me a purpose. It was enough for me, just to be near him, to see him safe and well. I never, ever thought to take him. I never believed I had the right. I just wanted him to be happy. when he told me he was writing to you and that you were to be his wife. It broke my heart, but I told myself that if you could make him happy, if you could build the home he deserved, then that would have to be enough for me." They sat in silence, their shared confessions hanging in the air between them. The animosity, the jealousy, the resentment, it had all washed away, leaving behind a clean, sad, and profound understanding. They were not enemies. They were two women who had been caught in the cross-currents of a good man's blindness and his deep, abiding loneliness. That night, the strain of the past weeks finally caught up with Elias. He had been pushing himself too hard, his body not yet recovered from his injuries. The wound in his leg, which had been healing slowly, grew inflamed. A fever took hold of him, climbing with alarming speed. By midnight, he was shivering violently, his skin burning to the touch, his words a delirious, nonsensical mumble. The crisis threw Lila and Clara together. Their new, fragile truce immediately put to the test. They became a team, moving around his sickbed with a quiet, synchronized efficiency. Lila, remembering the helplessness she had felt during the storm, was determined to be useful this time. She fetched cool water from the well, kept the fire stoked, and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, her past fear replaced by a fierce, protective focus. Clara, with her practical knowledge, brewed herbal teas to fight the fever and changed his sweat-soaked linens with steady, capable hands. They worked through the long, dark hours, a silent vigil in the heart of the vast, sleeping plains. By his bedside, the three of them were finally stripped bare of all pretense. They were no longer husband, wife, and helper. They were simply three souls, bound together by love, pain, and circumstance, fighting a battle against the encroaching darkness. As they worked, they faced the truth of their situation, a love that did not fit into the neat boxes the world had built for it, a sorrow that was too deep to be borne alone, and the strange, unexpected grace of the companionship they now offered each other. Outside, the world was changing. The land had been in the grip of a brutal dry spell for months, the earth cracked and gasping, the red dust a constant, choking presence. But as the fever in Elias reached its terrifying peak, a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. A cool wind began to blow, carrying with it the clean, earthy scent of rain. And then it came. At first, it was just a few tentative drops, spotting the dusty window panes, but soon it became a steady, soaking downpour. It was a gentle, life-giving rain, not a violent storm. The sound of it drumming on the roof was a soothing percussion, a promise of renewal. It washed the dust from the air, darkened the thirsty soil, and seemed to cool the feverish brow of the land itself. As the first light of dawn filtered into the room, mingling with the soft glow of the lamp, Elias's shivering stopped. The violent heat began to recede from his skin. The rain outside softened to a gentle patter. The fever had broken. Lila and Clara, exhausted, had fallen asleep in chairs on either side of his bed. Elias awoke slowly, drifting up from a deep, dark well of fever dreams. His mind was clear and calm. He felt weak, but the fire was gone. He turned his head and saw them. Lila was slumped in her chair, her face soft and vulnerable in sleep. Clara was on his other side, her head resting on her arms on the edge of his bed, her resilience finally spent. They had stayed with him. They had fought for him, together. A profound, overwhelming sense of clarity washed over him. He had been so wrong, so blind. He had sought to fill the emptiness in his life with a single person, as if a human heart were a simple vessel to be filled. He had tried to choose one path, one future, when life had presented him with a truth far more complicated and far more beautiful. He reached out, his movements slow and weak. He laid one hand on Lila's, and with his other, he gently touched Clara's shoulder. They both stirred, their eyes fluttering open. They looked at him, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He looked from one to the other, from the woman who had come seeking safety and found a family, to the woman who had given her love in silence and was now, finally, seen. "I was wrong," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, but filled with a conviction that was absolute. "I was wrong to think I only needed one person." He squeezed their hands. "My heart isn't big enough to divide between you, but it's big enough to love you both." Elias Thorne's declaration did not magically solve their problems. It simply gave them a name. In the small, suffocating world of redemption, that name was scandal. The news that Clara Mayhew was now living at the Thorne Ranch, not as a helper, but as a permanent fixture alongside the legal misses. Thorne was a morsel of gossip so delectable, so outrageously sinful that it was feasted upon with ravenous glee. The verdict was swift and merciless. Elias Thorne was a man without morals, a bigamist in practice, if not in law. Lila Thorne was a pitiful, spineless creature, too weak to defend her own marriage bed. And Clara Mayhew was the triumphant harlot, the serpent who had finally slithered her way into the garden. Wagons would pass the Thorne property and slow down, their occupants staring with morbid curiosity as if it were a freak show. In town, conversations would cease when any of them entered a room. Doors that had once been open were now firmly shut. They were an island, ostracized by the very community they were a part of. But against this tide of judgment, Elias stood like a rock. The years of solitude had fortified him, and the clarity he'd found in his fever had forged a new, unshakable resolve. He had spent a lifetime living by the codes of others, the army, society, even the ghost of his first marriage. He was done. This small, strange, beautiful family he had stumbled into was his truth, and he would not hide it. He held his head high in town, his gaze direct and unflinching. He met the whispers with a stony silence that dared them to be spoken aloud. He opened his home not as a fortress against the world, but as a sovereign nation, with its own laws and its own definition of grace. Inside the ranch house, a new world was being born, a life constructed day by day from the raw materials of their shared truth. The awkwardness and tension did not vanish overnight, but they began to recede, replaced by a tentative, quiet rhythm. They were three sovereign entities learning to coexist, each carving out a new role not by discussion, but by instinct. Lila, the woman who had come west seeking a place to lose her past, found a place to build a future instead. She had always found solace in books, in the quiet order of words on a page. She saw the children of the few other isolated homesteads, growing up as wild and untaught as the land itself, and an idea took root. With Elias's blessing, she turned the small, unused front parlor into a schoolroom. She fashioned a chalkboard from a smoothed plank of wood painted black and solicited books from a sympathetic cousin back east. She started with 3 pupils, the shy, sun-browned children of a neighboring rancher who was more concerned with his children's literacy than with town gossip. Teaching transformed Lila. The timidity that had defined her began to melt away, replaced by a quiet authority. In front of her small class, her voice, once a hesitant whisper, became clear and steady. She found a purpose that was entirely her own, a way to bring light into this hard land that had nothing to do with being a wife or a victim. She was nurturing young minds, creating a small pocket of civilization in the wilderness. The children, who knew nothing of the scandal surrounding her, knew only her kindness and her patience. They adored her, and in their guileless affection, Lila began to heal. Clara, in turn, retreated to the one place she had always felt whole, the world of the horses. They were her domain, her sanctuary. She had a deep, intuitive understanding of the animals, a silent communion that surpassed words. She managed the breeding, the training, the health of the entire herd with a skill that bordered on artistry. Under her care, the Thorne horses, already of good stock, became known throughout the territory for their strength, intelligence, and spirit. Men who would scorn Elias in town would ride out to his ranch to bargain for one of Clara's foals. She would deal with them with a quiet, professional dignity that left no room for disrespect. In the barn, surrounded by the warm, honest scent of hay and horse, she was not the other woman. She was a master of her craft. Her love for Elias, once a source of silent pain, was now channeled into the lifeblood of the ranch, a tangible, productive force. Elias worked the land. He was the anchor, the central point around which their two worlds revolved. He rose before the sun and worked until his muscles ached, pouring his energy into the soil. He expanded the fields, repaired the fences, and managed the business of the ranch. But his work was different now. Before, he had worked to keep the loneliness at bay. Now, he worked with a deep, abiding sense of purpose. He was providing for his family. Every fence post he set, every furrow he plowed, was an act of devotion. Their evenings became the sacred heart of their new life. They would gather around the dinner table, tired from their respective labors, and share the stories of their day. Lila would talk about a student who had finally learned to read his name. Clara would describe the progress of a new colt. Elias would speak of the rains and the crops. In these moments, they were not a scandal. They were a family. The house, which had held so much silence and pain, was now filled with the low, comfortable murmur of their shared existence. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the attitude of the outside world began to shift. Redemption was a hard place, and survival often depended on one's neighbors. One winter, a wave of sickness swept through the territory. When the town's doctor fell ill himself, it was Clara, with her deep knowledge of herbal remedies and her fearless experience with fever, who rode from homestead to homestead, offering her help. She sat with sick children, brewed her healing teas, and saved more than one life with her steady, compassionate care. When a fire broke out at the Gables General Store, it was Elias who organized the bucket brigade, his calm, authoritative voice cutting through the panic and directing the men with a soldier's efficiency, saving the building from being a total loss. And it was Lila's students who began to read letters for their illiterate parents and write replies, connecting these isolated families to the wider world. Actions began to speak louder than whispers. The townspeople, who had been so quick to judge, began to see not a den of sin, but a household of three capable, kind, and hard-working people who were a credit to the community. The gossip did not die entirely. It merely retreated, muttered in the darkest corners rather than proclaimed in the open street. An unspoken truce was declared. The Thorn Ranch was different. Yes, but it was also good. The family they had forged was strange, but it was also strong. And in a land where strength was the highest virtue, it commanded a grudging respect. One afternoon in late summer, when the land was golden and the air was soft, Elias led Lila and Clara to his favorite spot on the ranch, a place where the creek widened into a deep, clear pool, shaded by a grove of ancient cottonwood trees. The light filtered through the leaves, dappling the water in shifting patterns of gold. It was a place of profound peace. He had not told them why he was bringing them there. He simply took each of them by the hand. They stood on the bank, the three of them, the gentle sound of the water burbling over the stones, the only sound. "I was married once by a preacher, with a good book and the law to say it was right," Elias began, his voice low and steady. "And I am married now to you, Lila, by that same law. But the law doesn't know the whole truth of it. My heart knows a different kind of truth." He turned to Lila, his gray eyes filled with a deep, quiet affection. "Lila, you came into my life like a frightened bird, and you have built a nest here that has given this place a soul. You brought gentleness and learning to my home. You have my respect, and you have my protection. Always. And you have my love." Then he turned to Clara, his hand tightening on hers. His voice grew thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Clara, you were the light in my darkness for so long, and I was too blind to see it. You held me together when I would have fallen apart. You are as much a part of me as the blood in my veins. You have my heart, which you have owned for longer than I ever knew. And you have my love." He looked from one to the other, his face open and vulnerable. "The world doesn't have a ceremony for what we are. It doesn't have a name for it. So we will make our own." He knelt and picked up 3 smooth, flat stones from the water's edge, 1 for each of them. He gave 1 to Lila and 1 to Clara. "This land is our church," he said, his voice resonating in the quiet grove. "This sky is our witness. With these stones, we bind our lives together. Not as a husband and 2 wives, but as one family, to care for each other, to honor each other, and to love each other for as long as we live." They stood in silence, holding the stones, the weight of his words settling over them. There were no rings, no promises of obedience, only a simple, profound declaration of a bond that defied all convention. It was a truth consecrated by shared pain, earned respect, and a love that had proven itself stronger than law or shame. That night, the last of the walls between them came down, in the quiet darkness of the ranch house, under the vast, star-filled sky. Their union was finally made whole. It was not an act of possession or duty, but a quiet, tender exploration of their new reality. There was a reverence in their touch, a deep and profound respect for the difficult journey that had brought them to this moment. For Clara, it was the culmination of a lifetime of silent devotion, a love that was finally answered with a touch as honest and true as her own. For Lila, whose body had known fear, it was an act of ultimate trust, a gentle, healing embrace that asked for nothing but offered a profound sense of belonging. And for Elias, it was an act of atonement and of wholeness, a way of loving both the parts of his soul that these 2 different women had come to represent, the gentle hope for the future and the steadfast anchor to his past. He was no longer a man divided, but a man made complete. The story of the Thorn Ranch became a quiet legend in the territory, a tale that was told around campfires with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. It was the story of the reclusive widower, his mail-order bride, and the silent widow who lived together in a strange and inexplicable harmony. The final chapter of their story was not written in words, but in a single, indelible image. It is an evening in early autumn, the air crisp and smelling of hay. The sun is setting over the plains, painting the endless sky in brilliant strokes of orange, pink, and gold. 3 figures stand on a low rise overlooking the ranch. Elias stands in the middle, a tall, solid silhouette. On one side stands Lila, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, her face, no longer timid, turned toward the horizon with a quiet confidence. On his other side stands Clara, her hand in his, her profile serene and strong against the fading light. They are not looking at each other, but out at the land they have tamed together, at the home they have built. They are a family, forged not by law or by scripture, but by the fierce, resilient, and boundless capacity of the human heart to love, to endure, and to find its own way home. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello. For more stories from the heart of the American West, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts on the journey of Elias, Clara, and Lila.